Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Learning with Tia. Today, in this short video, we'll be talking about audit evidence. So let's get started. According to paragraph 17 of ASA 200, and remember that's the ASA that talks about the objective of the audit and the goals of the auditor, according to paragraph 17 it says that in order for the auditor to provide reasonable assurance, they must obtain sufficient, appropriate audit evidence. So the emphasis is audit evidence, and the key characteristics we'll be focusing on is sufficient, appropriate. So the first question is, okay, well, what is audit evidence? Well, the auditing standard that delves into audit evidence and the requirements of audit evidence comes down to ASA 500. So ASA 500. Now, in ASA 500, and more specifically paragraph 5, the audit evidence is defined as, Audit evidence is defined as all of the information used by the auditor in arriving at the conclusion on which the audit opinion is based. So what does this mean? It basically means that all the information, everything that is used by the auditor in ultimately determining their audit opinion is essentially defined as audit evidence. So all of the supporting documentations, all of the contracts, all of the invoices, everything that is used as part of the audit and aiding the auditor to get to their final conclusion, all of that information, whether it's documented or verbal, is classed as audit evidence. Now, as I said earlier, audit evidence is covered under ASA 500, but what I want to bring your attention to specifically is paragraph 6. So I'll just do a dot 6 over here. Paragraph 6 goes on to say that the auditor must gather what we call sufficient, appropriate audit evidence. Now, let's delve into these two concepts. In order to do that, I'll just do a little line for you. And I want you to make sure you write this down in your notes. Ladies and gentlemen, when we use the term sufficient, we are referring to quantity. So when we talk about the sufficiency of audit, or evidence, I should say, we're talking about the quantity of the evidence. The term appropriate is used in reference to quality. Here we go, quality. So when we talk about requiring audit evidence to be sufficient and appropriate, we're talking about making sure that there is enough audit evidence, and the audit evidence that is collected is of high quality. So sufficient appropriate essentially means we want to make sure we have enough good quality audit evidence to support the conclusions that are ultimately determined based on that evidence. The final thing to mention here is that though ASA 500 requires the auditor to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, so sufficient enough good quality audit evidence to support their conclusions, the standard doesn't actually specify, well, what is quality and how much quantity does the auditor need? Rather, ASA 500 goes on to say the auditor must use their professional judgment in determining these factors. So once again, guys, we have the need for judgment coming into the audit process. So though there are some guidelines regarding quality and quantity requirements, ultimately a great deal of this does come down to the professional judgment of the auditor. So what we just discussed is presented here visually, whereby the term sufficient appropriate audit evidence is split into the two characteristics being sufficiency and appropriateness. Ladies and gentlemen, just remember, sufficiency relates to the quantity of audit evidence, making sure we have enough evidence to support our conclusions. I'll just change that. Enough audit evidence to support our conclusions, whereby appropriateness relates to the relevance and the reliability of evidence. And these together kind of relate to the quality of the evidence in terms of, well, is it relevant to what it is I'm trying to get evidence or support for? And is it reliable? Can I rely on this evidence? Is it coming from a reliable source, for example? And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail very soon. So again, just remember, guys, it's very important for the auditor to ultimately design their procedures and perform their testing in order to collect enough, so sufficient, and good quality, appropriate evidence to support their conclusions. When we talk about the appropriateness side, remember that's talking about quality, and quality comes down to the connection between the evidence and the assertion or the test that was being performed. So that's relevance over here. And also it's influenced by the nature of the evidence itself, the reliability of that evidence. So let's delve into that a bit further now. When we talk about the reliability or the quality of audit evidence, we must recognize that reliability is influenced by two very important things. Number one, the nature. What form does the evidence come in? Is it written form? Is it verbal? What form do we actually obtain this evidence? The second thing, and this is quite important, is the source. Where is the information? Where is the evidence coming from? Who are we obtaining this evidence from? So what I've provided here is just a few points to think about, and these are quite logical, to be honest with you, but these are some things that kind of attribute to how we deem the quality of evidence to be. So for example, the first point, evidence that comes from sources outside of an entity, of the entity being audited, is deemed to be more reliable compared to evidence obtained solely from within that entity. What does that mean? That means evidence that we obtain from a third party, someone outside of the organization that we are auditing, is deemed to be of higher quality or higher reliability compared to information we get from the entity itself. Ladies and gentlemen, this comes down to one very important thing to understand. When information comes from or passes through the client before reaching us, the auditor, it loses some reliability. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, as soon as information comes from or passes through the client before it gets to us, there is a risk that the client can potentially manipulate that information. Therefore, we class evidence that we obtain from third parties outside of the client more reliable because there's a lesser chance of manipulation. Now, it's not an absolute rule, but it's just one particular thing to consider when it comes to evaluating evidence that we obtain. The second factor to be mindful of is evidence generated internally, so within the client, is more reliable when the internal control structure within the client is indeed effective. One way of thinking about this is information that comes from the accounting system that the client uses would be deemed to be more reliable if the controls within that system work, if they are effective, operating effectively, doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I've said this in class to you all before, guys, when information comes out of a system, if you've tested the system and you're happy and comfortable that the system is working, you are more comfortable with the information that comes out of that system. And that's what this second point is talking about. The third point is evidence obtained directly by the auditor is often deemed to be more reliable than evidence obtained from the client. Now, a good example of this is if we want to know how many items of inventory the client has, instead of relying on them counting the number of inventory and letting us know what that number is, we would feel like it's more reliable if we did the count ourselves, if we perform the stock take ourselves. Now, this doesn't mean that we'll always do that, but it means if we have the option, we feel that it's more reliable we would rely more on evidence that we obtained ourselves rather than the evidence obtained from the client. So far, guys, we've been talking about the source of the information. Now let's move on to nature. The first thing to be mindful of, and again, this is quite logical, evidence in the form of documents or written representations, anything in hard copy, is deemed to be more reliable than any evidence obtained through oral representations. What does this mean? It means paper is better than words in person, right? So written documentation is deemed to be more reliable than any information or evidence given to us verbally. And that's a pretty logical conclusion to be reaching. The second point to mention here is evidence obtained by original documentation is deemed to be more reliable than evidence provided through photocopies. And this basically means that if we want to see, for example, the bank statement of a particular client, we would feel that it is more reliable to rely on the original document or the original copy of the bank statement rather than a photocopy. Why is that? Well, if they're giving you a photocopy, the risk is, well, maybe they manipulated something on the original document, photocopied it to potentially get rid of any traces of the manipulation, and then given you the photocopied version. So we always rely more on original documentation rather than photocopies or faxes of the original. So these are some of the factors to think about when it comes to determining whether the audit evidence we have obtained is indeed reliable and it satisfies that appropriateness characteristic that we want from the audit evidence that we collect. And that's it, guys. Well done on getting through another video. If you do have any questions, please do let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and I'll see you in class. Bye.